Open our eyes this morning and wake up.
Morning. There used to be a song called Come Saturday Morning, wasn't there? Back in the 60s. What happens on Saturday morning? I'm going to try something here. I'm going to do a Joe Stevens and preach from my tablet. Does Joe preach from his tablet when he comes here? Yeah. He taught my son to do that. I remember the first time they came out with, paper, just in case. First time they came out with a Bible on electronic device, I was talking to a pastor in the fellowship about that, and he said, I don't think I could ever read my Bible off an electronic device. It just doesn't seem right. I said, that's probably what the scroll people said to Gutenberg, Okay, history buffs, Gutenberg, first printed Bible, scrolls, never mind. That works a lot better with an older generation of people. Joe was he was the very first young man in our congregation to get sent out. And I'm going to say 11 or 12 years old when his parents were first sent out. And there was wailing and gnashing of teeth amongst the young women in our congregation. See, I do children's church, and I'd been doing children's church for a long time, so I had no idea they'd been announced to go out. And all I saw is at the end of the service, I think it was a Friday night service, all these young girls are crying. And they're just like weeping. And this terrible thing has happened. I thought someone must have died in the service or something. It turned out, no, Joey Stevens is being sent out. And what's this congregation going to do? How are they going to survive without that handsome young man in our congregation? Let's look at Luke. See, all of a sudden got to go to the paper because I know it's at the top. Luke chapter 2. And this morning I'm actually going to do a 3-point sermon spread out over 3 different seminars. And it was some inspiration that I've got several years ago about Jesus and him growing up and becoming a young man. And it's documented in here. And what we'll do is we'll do the first point, a little bit of questions if you have any after the first point. We'll go right into the second point. And then at 11 o'clock, 11 o'clock we take a break? Is it 11 o'clock? No. At 10:30, we're going to take a break. I think they got us set up over there with goodies. I'm sure it's all health food. Because they take the calories in the middle right out of those donuts, so it just makes them a lot, that's my opinion anyway, it just makes it a lot healthier. So, I'm going to illustrate this story with something that sounds a little strange, but it's going to fit right in. It has to do with where I was working when I first got saved. I worked at an ornamental iron shop. I was a welder. And the boss at the shop had contracted with the church to build the window guards at the church. And that's how I ended up getting saved. The men went down to install the window guards. Pastor Warner sat there in his wheelchair and witnessed to them for 9 hours while they're installing all these window guards. They came back to the church to talk about this crazy old guy in the wheelchair. They had a pass, a free pass. Ooh, that was the key word for Susan and me. It was a free pass to a music night. They threw it in the trash can, and I grabbed it out, told Susan to get a babysitter for her oldest child because you didn't know what was going to go on down there. And we went down and we got saved. That's a very, very short version of a very long story that has to do a lot with how God works in people's lives. My boss was an alcoholic, and my boss had been dry for 10 years. And he built this business up to one of the most successful welding shops in Tucson. But he went in cycles. He used to tell me proudly of the cycles he went in, where he'd build something up till he could afford to start drinking again. And then he'd drink, and he'd drink until he had nothing left except tools. And then he'd sober up. He'd go with his tools, get a job welding somewhere. He's very good. Earn some money, get some good union wages from doing that. Come back, start another shop, build it up. And he'd gone through that cycle 4 times in his life. And I experienced his very last cycle of that. I was the foreman for the welding shop. And one day, one of the workers came in and said, "Have you seen Dave today?" And I said, "No, I haven't seen Dave." He says, "Well, his car's in front of the liquor store up on First Avenue." And that was not a good sign. He didn't show up for work for 3 or 4 days. I actually went under the disguise of reporting to him how the shop was going. And during that opportunity, I got an opportunity to witness to him. Now, I had witnessed to him for 2 years, but he always rejected. And he was a very intelligent man. I think his IQ was around 160. And so he was able to figure out and, argue and that sort of thing. He said 2 things during that conversation that just blew my mind. The very first was, as I was telling him, I got to tell him the entire gospel from beginning to end. I'm talking an hour and a half of straight witnessing with him listening, him paying attention. And he said to me, one thing he said is, I always thought you were smarter than I was, which just blew my mind. He says, because whenever I bring up this stuff, you just sit there very wisely and quietly and you wouldn't argue with me. Truth was, I didn't know enough to argue because I was just a young convert. And then I read a scripture later on in Psalms that said, a silent man seems to be wise. And so that gave me a little bit of a clue. The entire time that I didn't get through to him was paid off on that last night when I witnessed to him. Right to the point where I closed my witness by saying, and Jesus accomplished all of this in only 3 years. And this man that was sitting across the table from me, totally open and totally listening, you could see his countenance change. And it's like he darkened. And he got angry, and he looked me right straight in the eye, and he says, don't ever tell me he only had 3 years. He had 33 years. And I realized that Dave had just given himself over to that demon that had possessed him all those years. He was open. He was open that night, and that was his final night. Next morning, they found him in the garage with both the vehicles turned on, had committed suicide. But he had that opportunity. But the thing that struck me was, why was it so important that it wasn't 3 years, it was 33? And then I read the scripture we're going to look at today, and I realized, because Jesus' ministry didn't start when John baptized him. Jesus' ministry started when his parents took him home from Bethlehem, or took him from Bethlehem. His ministry started when his parents started raising him. And so we're going to look at the influence of parents on kids. And this is a learning exercise today. And by that I mean we're going to teach all of us, we're going to learn together what kids need to learn. Remember we said last night, children are tomorrow's church. Our purpose is to raise tomorrow's church. They're the next generation church. What do they need to know if they're going to be the next generation church? Now, I'm going to do 2 things right now. My voice is already starting to fail, which is a terrible thing for me because I love to talk. So I'm going to ask if someone would like to read a long scripture for me. We can get a microphone for you. Does anybody would like to just read in Luke chapter 2? And that will give me a chance to, there you go. Thank you very much. We're going to Luke chapter 2, 41 through 52. So it's 11 verses. If you would just read that for us, appreciate it. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah? Okay. Hang on. So, this story is the only thing we know about Jesus from the time he was born until the time he went into public ministry. The Bible's totally silent about that. Now, having been raised a Catholic, I thought there was a whole bunch of stuff that Jesus had done during that period of time. In the Catholic Church, I learned that, he had once turned a clay pigeon into a live bird, and that, he did all these miracles and that sort of thing. I also learned he was an only child, which didn't quite jive with the scriptures. But I didn't know all the other things that happened to Jesus during that time. So we're ready with the scripture? Okay, please, thank you. You have a mic? Okay.
Hello? Okay. Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem after the custom of the feast. And when they had fulfilled the days, as they returned, the child Jesus tarried behind in Jerusalem, and Joseph and his mother knew not of it. But they, supposing him to have been in the company, went a day's journey, and they sought him among their kinsfolk and acquaintance. And when they found him not, they turned back again to Jerusalem, seeking him. And it came to pass that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions. And all that heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. And when they saw him, they were amazed. And his mother said unto him, Son, why hast thou thus dealt with us? Behold, thy father and I have sought thee sorrowing. And he said unto them, How is it that ye sought me? Was you not that I must be about my father's business? And they understood not the saying which he spoke unto them. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth, and was subject unto them, but his mother kept all these sayings in her heart.
And then the key verse, 52. Just read verse 52.
And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature, and in favor with God and man.
He increased in wisdom and stature, and in favor with God and man. Those are the only things we know about Jesus from the time he's 12 until the time he starts his public ministry. We do know that he was very knowledgeable in the scriptures because he discussed those scriptures with the priests in the temple, the doctors, it calls them, in the temple. He discussed those scriptures, but we don't know anything else that happened except his parents had influence over his life for that period of time. And I believe that God gives each of us children and gifts us specifically for those children that he gives us. And I believe that he gifted Mary and Joseph to minister to Jesus what he needed to know if he were going to go on to his public ministry. Now, these are not isolated virtues that we see in the scripture. If we look at in Acts chapter 6, verse 3, they're trying to pick somebody for ministry, and it says, Look ye out therefore from among you 7 men of good report, full of the Spirit and of wisdom, whom we can appoint over this business. There's 2 of those 3 qualifications. Good report. They need to be of good report. They need to be wise, people that are wise. This is not a top-down thing. This is not something that you give to your children. It's something your children accept from you. So it's not something you're going to set up a class for your kids and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. You know, we're going to spend the first couple of years getting wise, then we're going to work a little bit on your stature, then we're going to work on your wisdom, and by the time you're 18 years old, you're going to be able to go out there and minister. No, these things happen all the time as part of our discipleship of our kids. But there are key things to look for, and there's some things that sometimes we'll neglect as parents. Sometimes as parents, we'll kind of say, well, maybe that's not quite as important. So if we're going to raise the next generation church, the very first thing we need to know is that it's going to be a wise church. Think of your children in your congregation. Look at these children that are sitting here, right here. These lovely children who had to get up early to come this morning on Saturday morning. Was that tough? Was it hard getting up? Yes and no. Okay, so you got the morning person and the evening person. And that's something to consider about your kids. Are they morning people or are they evening people? One's okay getting up early in the morning. The other one's, I always loved getting up early in the morning because that's when I had my parents to myself. I had 6 siblings. And when you have 6 siblings, you don't always get your parents to yourself. But that early morning, as soon as the coffee started to brew, I could get in there, sit down at the kitchen table, and talk to them. And they could minister to me. They didn't think they were ministering. I didn't think they were ministering, but they did. We learned things during that time. So we need to have a wise church. 1 Corinthians 2:6 says, We speak wisdom among them that are perfect, yet not the wisdom of the world, nor the princes of this world. We're not giving our kids necessarily just the wisdom of the world. We don't want to totally discount the wisdom of the world because there's a lot there that our kids need to know. But we need to make sure that they're balancing the wisdom of the world with God's wisdom. And if there's a conflict, they know which one to choose. So that's the goal here. So what is wisdom? Wisdom, the word used for wisdom there, means insight, skill, either human or divine skill, and intelligence. So the very first thing that Mary and Joseph developed in Jesus was his intelligence, his wisdom. These are things that they're innate, which means they're part of who we are when we're born, but also we need to add to that. So our temperament, the person that we are when we're born, is going to receive wisdom. It's going to receive truth. And we want to make sure that the truth is real truth and not worldly truth. If your children were assigned something in school, an assignment in school, research such and such, where's probably the first place they're going to go? Someone? Just speak it out. I'm okay with that. Pardon me? Okay, they'll go to their parents. We wish they would just go to their parents. Okay. What do you think is the first place they're going to go if they say, okay, tell me the history of the pyramids? They're going to go Google, right? Because when I used to teach computer classes, I told my students, Google knows all the correct answers. That's true. Google also knows all the incorrect answers. And wisdom is being able to look at those two things and decide which one's in line with God's wisdom, which one's the truly correct answer. Now, Google's going to help us out with this over the next year. My nephew-in-law just got bought up by Google about 2 years ago, and he got bought up by Google because he has a brand new, okay, excuse me, I'm not really good on math terms, algorithm. Is that the term? Thank you. He created an algorithm for search engines that had never been used before. Well, Google, knowing that this would be competitive to them, bought him up. So he lives in a nice house now in San Francisco, and he and his wife are just enjoying the life. And he goes into Google every day and plays on their video machines and that sort of thing. But now his company's owned by Google. I suspect that has to do with the announcement Google made a couple of months ago about their new truth engine. So look this up. Look it up on Google. Google has developed a new truth engine using very sophisticated algorithms that are going to take all that information that's out on the websites and they're going to divide the true stuff from the false stuff. Now, it's really irritating when you go out and you do a Google search and you come up with this really wacko stuff. And I think most of the people who call in to talk radio shows, that's where they get their information. I Googled it as if, oh, yes, this came straight from the mouth of God. I Googled it, therefore it's true. So Google doesn't like having that reputation, so they're going to divide. They're going to decide. They're going to use this algorithm. Algorithm? Did I use the word right again? Okay, they're going to use this to take these websites and the ones that are, instead of how many links do you have, which is the way it works now, how many true links do you have? And so is this one giving good information? If so, okay, you get more points. And everybody gets raised up on the scale based on truth, on what's true. But whose truth is it? That's the question. Is it the truth that God gives to the world? Or is it the truth that Google gives to the world? We'll start with G. But Google's truth is the same truth that on January 20th, when a new president came into office, you no longer, when you search for President of the United States, all of a sudden, you didn't find pictures of monkeys anymore. Now you found the White House. That miraculously happened on January 20th when President Obama took office. Previous to that, you would find pictures of President Bush next to a monkey if you searched for President of the United States. Those are algorithms. They set those up. So keep in mind that when we're searching for information, it always needs to be measured back against the Word of God and what we know to be true, because there is definitely an agenda. And Google is part of that agenda. Now, I'm not going to stop me from using Google, but what I used to teach my kids was you need to know how to tell the difference between the site that's lying to you, the site that's trying to sell you something, and the site that is actually going to tell you what's going on. So we need to be aware of that, and our kids need to be aware of that as well. When Jesus was teaching, when he came back into Nazareth and he began teaching in Nazareth, remember what people said about him? What is this guy? Isn't this just a carpenter's son, right? This is a carpenter's kid. What's he saying stuff like this for? They were very amazed that he would speak wisdom. Now, true, Jesus is God. Jesus has all wisdom. But I believe a lot of that was imparted by Mary and Joseph. Otherwise, why would he have even given Jesus' parents? Didn't need to, He could have just said, boom, 33-year-old man, come into the river, get baptized, start the ministry. Why did he start Jesus off with parents? Because Jesus was there at creation. Why did he have to start with parents? Because God's trying to tell us this is a critical part of how we develop. So let's look at the wisdom and the wisdom that's going to be measured against the Word of God. The scriptures in Psalms 111:10 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. A good understanding have all they that do his commandments. His praise endureth forever." And then Proverbs 9 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the holy is understanding." And so fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. I always wondered about that term, fear of the Lord. Does that mean that we're supposed to be shaking in our boots whenever we think of God? Is that the type fear? Is it the fear that I always had of the Dean of Men at South Point Catholic High School? Brother Herman. That was when we defined fear of God in our catechism classes. It was Brother Herman. He was behind the attendance office. There was a little door. And all it said on there was, Brother Herman, Dean of Students. We thought dean meant persecutor in those days. If you looked up the word, we'd see a picture of him with these, they were Carmelites, and the Carmelites had these big, we're talking 3-inch wide belts that they wore around their habit. And these guys could get those things out quickly, very quickly. When the guys, girls, you never did this, but after gym class, the guys would fool around snapping towels at each other. Man, you never wanted Brother Herman's snap at you. He put the fear of God into you. So growing up with that background, I got saved and I read, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." I can't get smart until I get scared. Is that what that means? That word fear means respect. It means you fear the judgment of the Lord if you're on his wrong side, but it's more about respect of the Lord and knowing that he's there for our good, that God wants us to have a good finish. He's not there to make us happy. He's there to make us successful Christians, to help us become successful Christians. Now, if we want our kids to grow up to be Christian adults, they need to begin with a fear of the Lord. Unfortunately, that's not what they get exposed to most of the time. We had already mentioned Google, the internet. Most of our kids have access to the internet, and the truth is, anymore these days, it's almost a 24/7 thing. It's not something that we can isolate them from, even if we try it at home. They've got it at school, they've got it with their classmates, they've got it with their neighbors. It's there, okay? Social engineering always happens through the social networks. Yeah, well, my kids don't do social networks. I personally don't do social networks. That doesn't mean I'm not affected by them. I shudder to think what would happen if I ever joined Facebook and then just opened myself up to comments. Of course, I'd have all those nice people in El Paso would say, "Frank King, really nice guy, teaches good parenting classes, we love him. But there's some people that don't like me as much." I remember when I was teaching in high school, they first opened up the websites where the students could rate the teachers. And they had to block those from the school because vicious things happen on social networking. Kids have been driven to suicide because of things that are said about them. In the old days, keep going back to the old days, when we were just face-to-face with people, if I had a gripe with somebody, I'd go face-to-face with them. I'd say, "Hey, I hear you're saying such and such about me." You say, "Yeah, I am, and it's true." I say, "Well, it's not true." And it might come down to blows, I don't know. It might just come down to an argument, because sometimes arguments can end up with good results. But now, you don't even know who's attacking you. It's out there. And once it starts out there, it spreads out there. I was hearing I won't even get into that one. Never mind. There are people who will throw something out on the internet just to agitate other people. And because we're human beings, we fall into that. Family breakdown is adding to our kids' lack of wisdom, if we don't have a mom and a dad in the home, feeding into them. Last night we talked about the roles that a mother and a father have in raising a child. That's not existing anymore. Hate to keep going back to the olden days. When I was growing up, there were no divorced couples on our neighborhood. 0. One widow. Her husband had been a pilot, a test pilot, and he'd been killed. And so she didn't have a husband. But there were about 9 men in the neighborhood who would come over and fix things for her and take care of stuff and take the boys out fishing and that sort of thing. Now, last time when I was teaching high school, it was rare, very rare, that I'd have a child in my class who had both biological parents living at home with them. And in some cases, nobody. We had cases where 3 or 4 or 5 students would get together, pool their money, and rent an apartment, and you'd have a bunch of 16-year-olds. That's the household. That was their family. And we won't go and get sidetracked too much on that, but I know a guy who was a gang task force in Tucson said that's the main thing that causes the gangs to be so powerful. Kids are looking for family. And if they don't have family at home, they'll find the family on the street. It's something to belong to. And the same is true of these social networks. We've got drug issues that are happening. We've got the mental health issues. We've got the social networking narcissism, where we just want to see ourselves up posted and that sort of thing. And now that's starting to feed into almost everything that we do. Who rates really high in the political spectrum? The one that brags about how good he is and what he's going to do for us, and has doesn't need any substance anymore, just needs to be up there and noticed. We've got our the media that's influenced our kids. And so I had a parent come to me, this is probably close to 15 years ago, and she said, I've got a solution for all these R-rated movies that are out there in the market. And she'd found a service that'll take an R-rated movie and clean it up for you and make it PG so she could throw it to her kids. I said, well, how do they do that? He said, well, they take out all the cuss words, they take out all the sex scenes, and they just clean it up. I said, well, that's not the danger of the movies the kids are seeing. There's an underlying agenda in Hollywood that's being fed to our children, and it has nothing to do with what they're seeing or hearing on the screen. It has to do with the lifestyles of the people that are being represented on the screen. Those are the lifestyles that Hollywood says we're supposed to admire. Not just admire, but support. Not just support, but never, ever object to, or we're haters. That's an agenda that's been pushed down our throat. And it's the world's agenda. It's not God's agenda. Most people know that there's media bias in the news. We always talk about that. We hear about that all the time. But we do ignore what's going on in the movies. Let me give you a quote from a man named Edward Schlaps. I'd like to name a Schlaps, especially growing up in high school. He's a media studier, researcher at MIT. He wanted to figure out how media influences people. So he looked into whether shows that prominently featured gay men could lower prejudice against LGBTQ people. That acronym gets longer and longer every week. He and his colleagues surveyed people who watched Will and Grace. Now, I've got to be honest with you, I have no clue what that show is about, but a little bit of research tells me that one of the characters is a gay character and a very nice guy or girl. I'm not sure which one it is, it's Will or Grace. And you're supposed to measure whether or not they agreed with statements like sex between 2 men is just plain wrong and lesbians are sick. Sure enough, he found out that those who watched the show most often were least prejudiced against the gay community. Why? Because they saw it presented in such a way that how can you argue? Now, it might be opposed to what God's word says, but society says this is something that's okay. Now, lest you think this is just something that's brand new that started in the last 5 years as we're trying to push, same-sex marriage issues and that sort of thing, it's not. Been around for a really, really, really long time. Anybody know the name Norman Lear? Norman Lear. His name even sounds like someone who's... Anybody want to tell me who Norman Lear is? Good. He's a TV producer. So if you don't know who he is, then that's probably a pretty good thing. But those who were around in the 60s might remember some of his shows. All in the Family, Sanford and Sons, The Jeffersons, Maude, Good Times, One Day at a Time, and there are several others. Each of these shows depicted a lifestyle that was counter-biblical, but today is accepted in mainstream. I listened to Norman Lear being interviewed by Michael Medved about a year and a half ago. And he's an older guy now. He's in his 80s. And Michael Medved said, "Why did you get into television?" He'd been a successful movie producer. "Why'd you get into television?" He said, because he realized he had a certain mindset about way things ought to be, and he could influence other people by producing shows that promoted those things that he wanted other people to think. He wanted people to change their mind about the way life is and the way life ought to be. Now, if you remember back when, well, maybe you don't remember, but I remember back in the 40s and 50s, most of American life was based on biblical values. You couldn't even run for dog catcher if you weren't a Christian that went to church every Sunday. That doesn't happen anymore. And part of the reason is people like Norman Lear, who got in there and started teaching us what he wanted to know. 1994, I was reading Parade magazine. That's that little ad-in that comes in the middle of the papers. And I saw an interview with a guy in 1994, and his statement was, within 2 decades, homosexuality will be a totally accepted lifestyle. He said, the way I'm going to do that, I'm going to start introducing gay people into the media, into movies, into television, and they're not going to be evil people. They're all going to be nice. They're all going to be wonderful people. They're going to be the type people you're going to look at them and say, I'd like to have them living next door to me. That's a really neat guy. That's a wonderful woman. It was an agenda. And the agenda started back in the, actually it started back in the 80s. And so when we look today and we say, well, how did that happen so quickly? How did we all of a sudden get a Supreme Court ruling that says this is not only acceptable, but if you don't think it's acceptable, it's because you're a hater. The Supreme Court ruling said we're haters if we don't support that lifestyle. How did it get to that point? It got to that point because they set an agenda. They set that agenda back in 1984 with a book called After the Ball. And After the Ball was a book that set forth, this is how we're going to make this not only acceptable, but it's going to be the lifestyle to have. It's going to be one other people are going to envy. It's going to be the one kids in high school are going to say, yeah, I wish I was gay. It's all been pushed upon us by the media. So, going back to that parent who said, we'll take the cuss words out. We'll take the sex scenes out. If you don't take the underlying agenda out of what your kids are absorbing, they're going to absorb that. They're going to get, the devil's doctrine instead of God's doctrine. This is true in reading as well. Just read an article in Chuck Colson's website. They have started a new service where you can take kids' books and you can they'll be reviewed for you and you can look. And by the way, I should have mentioned this last night. I have a list of resources that I will send to anybody who wants them that has all these resources, websites, that sort of thing. And if you ask me afterwards, I'll give you a card. You can just email me or we'll send that back to you. The website will take books that are now being required reading for kids in school, and it'll analyze what the moral content of those books are. Because the gay agenda is now being pushed very heavily in adolescent and teen books. So a lot of the reading assignments that kids get in school are going to include those types of things in them. So as parents, we need to educate ourselves. We need to know what it is that our kids are being exposed to, how they're being exposed to them, and we need to make sure that they're getting the Word of God in them so that they can oppose that themselves. Our job is not to protect our kids. It's not to put them in some kind of a balloon or a bubble and make sure they never get exposed to this. Because the truth is, they will be exposed at some point in their life. And if we protect them all of their lives, at that point when they do get exposed, they won't have a defense. Susan and I always made sure that our kids could make some mistakes. And I think one mistake that a lot of parents make is they don't let their kids make mistakes. I mentioned last night that Pastor Mitchell says discipleship is giving someone a safe place to fail. Parenting is giving a child a safe place to fail. They need to be able to try something, and if it doesn't work, they need to suffer the consequences of what they tried. And this starts out at a very young age. It starts out, when Garrett wants to decide what color socks he's going to wear to school. And they don't match. Okay? So, unfortunately, Garrett was being raised in such a stage of life that the crazier the stuff you wore, the more accepted you were by kids. But our thought was, yeah, we'll just let him wear that. See what happens when the kids see him in that. How'd it go today at school? Oh, great. Everybody thought my outfit was cool. He's probably the only kid in middle school that wore a beanie with a propeller on it in middle school. He wore that thing for like a whole semester. Can't tell him not to do that. He liked doing that because that made him different. But we did let him fail on things. He came to me one time and he said, you know where we can get a mattress? Well, when your 12-year-old asks you where you can get a mattress, you kind of, what's going on here? So what do you need a mattress for? Well, he and his friend were going to jump off the friend's roof. And they wanted to jump, and they were going to put a mattress down there, so, absorb when they jumped. And I said, there could be some consequences. This is the word in our family was consequences. What are the consequences of your action? Well, there could be some consequences to jumping off the roof. No, I don't think so. We're going to have that mattress. We'll be safe. I said, what if you slip? What if you land on your head and break your neck? We're not going to do that. We're going to be okay. I said, there will be consequences. You're going to get hurt when you do this. And he says, well, how am I going to get hurt? I said, because if I find out you did it, I'm taking you to the back room with the paddle. And you'll get really hurt. Now, I don't know. I suspect he jumped off the roof. I would have when I was that age, right? Most of us guys would have. That's the difference between guys and girls. A guy and a girl do something and it ends up bad. They get hurt. The girls say, I'm not going to do that anymore. And the guys say, I must have done that wrong. Let me figure out a different way to do that. That's what makes people, And so they do. They jump, they'll try that. So we do have to let them suffer the consequences. But at the same time, we need to be there for them. We need to be in their schools. If they're going to school, we need to be meeting with their teachers. We need to make sure that their teachers understand that we'll support that teacher. Garrett, I hate to keep using Garrett. Don't tell Garrett. I used him all the time. He's probably got enough friends in this congregation he knows already. People are texting him, oh, your dad's using your example again. But Garrett, we mentioned last night, was a strong-willed child. So every single teacher he had from 1st through 6th grade called us up the first week of school. And they said variations of the same thing. It went from, I'm having a little trouble getting through to Garrett, to I'm moving him out of my classroom and never want to see him again for the rest of my life. We actually did have one student that said that. Just send him over to the other teacher. And so Susan and I would go in and we sit down and we explain strong-willed child. We explain Garrett needs to know what his boundaries are. And you need to be this person that sets those boundaries. And he will push until you set a boundary, and then he'll respect that boundary for a couple minutes. And then he'll start pushing again, and he'll see if you draw that boundary again. If you keep drawing that boundary the same place every time, he's going to push to that boundary. He's going to know that you're going to stand your line on that, and he's going to be okay with it. We'd tell that to the teachers, and then they come back a week later and say, oh, man, made all the difference in the world. One teacher made him student of the month. And that was a student that wanted him out of the classroom because they knew how to deal with his temperament. They knew how to deal with who he was. So we need to be involved. Susan was involved, I think, probably for 7 or 8 years. She was in, what do they call that? What was the initial for that? Parent involved? Wasn't the PTA. It was actually in the classroom working. Anyway, she'd go in and be a helper in the classroom. Now, she wasn't just there because she's altruistic and she wants to contribute to society. She's there to keep an eye on her kids, and keep an eye on the teachers. And she would she knew the teachers, and so she could kind of maneuver our kids into classrooms where the teachers were best suited to their learning styles and to who they were. So parent needs to be involved. You need to be watching what they're doing, watching what they're watching what they're using on the internet. I have a name of a filter that if a couple of filters. Your internet ought to be filtered. Your texting ought to be filtered. We were sitting at lunch with my son a couple months ago now, and right in the middle of lunch he goes, somebody just sent my daughter a bad word in a text. How do you know that? Because there's an application out there that does that for you. It monitors your kids' texts. And if it sees something that you want to put a caution against, it'll let you know. It does what they call it. I want to call it barbed wire fencing, but that's not what they call it. You give them an area they're allowed to be in. If they go outside the area, GPS sends you a notice. So your kid just went outside the area. You say, well, they'll just leave the phone at home. Yeah, right. Teenagers are going to leave the phone at home? I don't think so. So there are ways of monitoring that. There are filters. We have filters on our computers on our system at home that filters out anything that we don't want them to do. And in fact, it will lock out everything. I had a friend who was an 84-year-old woman who got a porn storm while she was researching something. She's 84 years old. She just got in the wrong place, and all of a sudden this stuff starts popping up on the screen. She calls me up, Frank, what do I do? So I put this filter on there, locked out everything except the 2 things she wanted. She wanted her email, and she wanted her doggy daycare site. She has her doggy in doggy daycare. And she needs to go on their video cameras and look at her doggy playing with the other doggies. And she wants to do that, so we let her do that. And then everything else gets blocked. And then I'd look at the filter every morning, and I'd say, looks like you tried to go such and such. Is that somewhere you wanted to be? You don't know where that computer's trying to take you. And she'd say, oh, yeah, I do want to go there because that's my granddaughter's school. And so we'd open that up. Ended up, she had an internet that consisted of maybe 10 servers in the entire universe. But you can filter down that closely for your kids if you need to. And I advise you to do that because there's stuff out there, I guarantee, we don't want them being part of what's out there. Okay, let's look at, let's just take that as kind of a stopping point before we move into point 2. Wisdom. Any questions anybody has on any of what we just talked about there? Let me give it, if you have a pencil, let me give you an email address. If you send me an email address and just say El Paso Resources, I'll send you back a link sheet that's got all these things that I've been talking about, all the filters, the websites, good books you ought to have for your kids. If you've got a strong-willed child, what the reading assignments ought to be for a parent. So it's just frank.king, F-R-A-N-K, period, K-I-N-G, at thedoorcfc.com, THEDOORCFC.com. And if you just send me, anytime, just send me, say, El Paso Resources, I'll be happy to forward those to you. Okay, any questions? Anything we talked about as far as the wisdom? I know it's kind of a scary session, but it's pretty scary out there. Okay, the second thing that we know that Jesus was, we know a quality that Jesus had was his stature. So stature has to do with age, it has to do with health, it has to do with being physical. So we know that Mary and Joseph put some input into Jesus. I don't know, did he play on the soccer team? I don't know. But Jesus did physical stuff. And because the stature is something that depends on things like, what are you eating? How well are you sleeping? What kind of exercise are you getting? Are you getting exercise? I know we always like to quote that, exercise profiteth little, but it does profit some, right? Usually it's people that have a little bit extra that like that one. But exercise does profit. It's important. It's especially important for boys. I had a feminist boss one time when I was teaching high school. She was the assistant principal. And when I first started teaching, I didn't know anything about teaching. I didn't know what a lesson plan was. I didn't know curriculum. I didn't know any of that stuff. So she helped me in my curriculum, and she showed me her curriculum. And I noticed an interesting thread throughout her curriculum. Whether she was teaching history or social studies or current events, if she was teaching biology, if she was teaching history, if she was teaching English grammar or English lit, threaded throughout all of it was women's issues. And it'd be like the first point she'd cover. Today we're going to talk about English literature. And first we'll talk about all the women authors in English literature. And then the guys would just get kind of, and I said, is this a normal curriculum? He said, no. He says, my major was women's studies. So I majored in women's studies, and so when I teach, I always like to bring that in. And it's true. The female perspective hadn't been presented as much as it could have been early in the education process. But then something happened to her that took all of her feminist ideas and threw them out the window. She got pregnant. So, this woman who had been telling me what I need to do in school was all of a sudden saying, hey, you do stuff with kids, right? How do I know the paint's going to be safe in the nursery when I paint the nursery? And what should I be playing that classical music to my baby while he's in utero? Because they have those speaker things, you can put them on there and play the classical music and they come out a lot smarter. And all of a sudden she's very interested. But the most interesting thing was after the baby was born. He was a boy. And as she went into labor, she came into me. I was one of the tech guys in the school. And she says, I want to make sure that I can keep working. Says, so I've got my laptop. I need you to get me remotely in. Says, when I'm going to the hospital, I'm going to be working on curriculum while I'm in labor. She's got this because she's going to do her job. And you need to set me up because the doctor says that I have to stay off work for at least a week after this baby's born. And I can't do that. So make sure I'm connected from home. Well, long story short, that make sure I'm connected 100% all the time got down to hardly using it at all. Because all of a sudden she's bringing home a baby, a miracle, this wonderful thing that God has given her. She won't admit it came from God, but she's looking at this baby. She's saying, wow. She used the term miracle for the first time in her life when she saw that child. And then this baby boy started growing. He got about 6 months old. That's when she came to me with the next question. By then, she had gone part-time and 0 time, and now she was a full-time mom. And so she only came into school once in a while to visit her friends. She was a full-time mom. Great transformation. She says, Frank, I got a question for you. She says, my husband, he's a Marine, former Marine, and I think he plays kind of rough with my son. He's down there he's only 6 months old. He's wrestling with him and rolling him around on the floor with him. And, he's going to hurt him or something. And so we had to talk about, a man feeds something into a child, a woman feeds something else. That boy's going to learn how to be a man from his father. This is a good thing. You got to get that physical exercise, Put him on a soccer team when he's 4. Saw the 4-year-olds on a soccer team the other day. We were at my grandson's soccer. That's a fun-looking game with a bunch of 4-year-olds. Ants on a crumb, That soccer ball's a crumb, and they go. They do it better than they did when my kids were young. Now they do a very small field with very small nets, and they have 3 kids on a team. So it's a little bit easier to manage. And there's no goalie. So sometimes it only takes them 10 minutes to make a goal with no goalie. But get them on some teams. As long as you're not interfering with your ministry or with church, make sure they're getting out there and getting some exercise. My greatest memory of my life, one of the greatest memories of my life, was my father at my football games. My father despised sports. He grew up not playing any sports. He didn't want to play sports. when I decided I wanted to play real football, tackle football, my dad said, you know, there's a chance you could get hurt. My mom was listening. She says, well, if you think you're going to get hurt, you're going to get hurt. Just go out there and play your hardest and hurt the other guy, you know. So, whoa. So my dad was that kind of guy. But when I started playing football, all of a sudden, I don't know, he just got an interest. And so he started coming to my games. And he attended every single game my senior year. It was a bad year for my football team. To this day, when they're trying to talk about this high school starting out poorly, they say this is their worst start since 1966, which was my team. We lost 8 out of 10. Terrible game, but my dad was always there to encourage me after the game, and he became a football fan. He loved any time football was on TV, he was going to watch it, except Dallas Cowboys. I'm sorry, do we have any Dallas fans here? Probably not. No, I don't think so. This is West Texas. We don't do Dallas here. And here's the reason, give you a little insight to who my dad was. He was watching a Dallas game one time. Tom Landry was a coach. When would that have been? Back in the 60s or something like that? And Tom Landry refused to shake hands with the opposing coach after the game. That was it. As far as my dad was concerned, Tom Landry's a devil. The whole team are a bunch of demons. I'm gonna pray against them for the rest of my life. And he did. He hated the Dallas Cowboys. Ironically, 2 of my sons are Dallas Cowboys fans, so they kept it quiet when my dad was still alive and didn't let him know that. But I do remember him coming to those games, and that changed my life and it changed his life. Be involved in your kids. Remember last night we were talking about Deuteronomy. It says, when do you teach your kids? You teach them when you're moving around. You're driving, it says walking around, but now it'd be driving around. You teach them when you sit down at night, when you get up in the morning. You're with them. It's relationship. It's being part of who they are. I was thinking Saturday morning, we're all getting here a little bit late. Saturday morning, people are out there. They're trying to get to their, their hardware store and that sort of thing. And I was thinking of one time, Garrett and I had gone out on a Saturday morning, just pick up something from the hardware store, and we're out driving. That was back in the olden days. When we didn't have our air conditioning was just roll down the window, and driving around. It was kind of noisy and heavy traffic and that sort of thing. And Susan and I always tried to kind of draw things out of the kids. The dinner table, we'd ask them questions, that sort of thing. So when we came home, that's the first thing Susan said. Says, so what's new out there? What'd you learn? And Garrett said, when Dad's driving, there's a whole lot more idiots on the road. Okay, he's learning. And that's the point of that. They learn all the time, as we mentioned last night. And when we were talking about grandparents, make sure you're encouraging them to learn and be part of that. We went to every one of our kids' soccer games growing up. 3 kids, 3 different teams, sometimes 3 different locations. We were at their soccer games if it didn't interfere with church. And I'd encourage you, be part of that. They'll remember that. Susan will say that to me. Saturday morning, we have grandkids. They're going to be out there playing soccer. Susan will say, we probably ought to be there. And I'm thinking, I don't know. Saturday morning, kind of got stuff to catch up around the house. And she goes, what's that line she always uses? It's like, these are going to be the times they remember, and there's not that many left. I've got 2 grandsons that are 15 years old now. Okay. So, be part. Give kids a chance to exercise. Now, how about rest? Had the conversation last night at dinner about sleep. Are your kids getting enough sleep? How much sleep do your kids need? Recent studies say 10 to 12 hours for adolescents and teens. So, let's make sure they're getting some sleep. What happens if you don't get some sleep? Well, you're going to be in big trouble. I went for a long time with very little sleep, and I almost had a psychotic breakdown. Because here's something interesting about sleep. This is good for all of us, but especially for kids. When you first go to sleep, your body gets rested. You sleep in cycles. So you lay down, Takes a little while. You start to go to sleep. You get into this really, really deep cycle. And during that really, really deep cycle, things rejuvenate. Well, the first 3 or 4 sleep cycles, by the way, are about 90 minutes apart. If you want to test that sometime, just see how often you're getting up in the middle of the night. Going to get up, going to do something, okay? Got to get up, use the bathroom. Check the clock. 90 minutes later, you're getting up again. Well, my age you are anyway. So anyway, you're sleeping in 90-minute cycles. So the first part of that 90-minute cycle, your body gets rejuvenated. You know, all the cells get cleaned out. You get rested, okay? And about the first 3 cycles of that, first 3 90-minute cycles, it's almost all body. And then about after the 4th 90-minute cycle, so we're talking what, 4.5 hours? After 4.5 hours sleep or so, it starts to work on the brain. I heard scientists describe it as taking out the garbage. When they look at scans of people who are sleeping, all of a sudden their blood levels of toxins increases as the brain begins to get rid of all that clutter that's in there. One guy described it as defragging the brain. But that doesn't happen until you've been sleeping for about 4 hours. I went 20 years on 4 to 5 hours sleep. My brain never got cleaned out. And it got to be pretty serious. I would get to be a pretty crazy guy. Okay? So then, for the next 4 hours of sleep, you're primarily cleaning your brain. You're refreshing your brain. But your brain never gets refreshed till after your body's been refreshed. So it's important to get those long sleep, and especially for kids that are in school. The brain doesn't get defrag until about the 6th hour. So your 6th hour of sleep, that's when your brain is finally starting to get into a clean state where you can use it again the next day. Teens need about 8 to 10 hours sleep. The good news is you can catch up on Saturday. Sleep cycles work in such a way that it's a 7-day cycle of these 90-minute cycles. So let's say Sunday night your kids stay up late to do their homework because they didn't do it all weekend long when they were supposed to do it, and they're up late, and they only got 6 hours sleep on Sunday night. They can make that up anytime in the next 7 days. So you're going to be able to make that sleep up. Okay, I'm going to do something that's very, very, very unconventional. And some of you need to do it too. I'm going to call for a bathroom break because I'm looking at some glossy eyes and I'm feeling some myself. And so I want to take about a 5-minute break and get up, move around a little bit. Let me do that.